Greetings, greenhouse people. As always, I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and like I try to remind you every time, we're pleased to offer this discussion in video and podcast formats. My guest today is back to share more tips and tricks. Dr. Will Healy is our favorite recently retired technical manager from Ball Seed. He's here today to talk Dianthus, or as we both like to remind everyone, Sweet William, which is a name that I think characterizes us both. This is a part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials and vegetables commercially produced around the world. If you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite app and find hundreds of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. Enough out of me. Will, why Dianthus? I mean, I know there's been a ton of new breeding in the last decade or so, and I'm guessing the crop is on the rise, but why are we here to talk Dianthus today?
Well, I've always loved Dianthus ever since I'm a young child when my grandmother would plant Sweet William because she always thought of me that way.
So did my mom every year.
But there was a breeder basically in France that bred an incredible selection of varieties. And they were actually in two series. And they're, if you remember the old Floral Lace, a great series, great colors, wide, and basically fantastic pack performance, garden performance. And then Linda Lochner at Pan American Seed picked up that breeding program when Pan Am bought out the French breeding company, and she took it to a whole new level with cut flower varieties that basically work in pots and large containers. And so there's just this incredible variety of plant material. And then of course, the other piece that makes Dianthus so special is the fragrance. People really like fragrance. Now, of course, it's kind of interesting that if you go back 60 years ago, back in the 60s, where carnations were, the smell of carnations was associated with death. And so they tried to breed the scent out of carnations. But now they're doing a lot of work breeding the scent back into carnations. So, and the whole Dianthus class. So this is one that basically hits all the senses. It basically excites people in the colors. It hits the fragrance, and for a grower, it performs well in a number of different containers in a number of different environments. So let's talk about how you finish really successful Dianthus, because, of course, now with all the different breeding brings a whole series of different issues up that growers may need to be aware of as they start selecting and adding more Dianthus varieties to their assortment. So, as always, we always talk about plant immediately, but there's a little twist here that you need to be aware of, is that this is a long day plant. And so if you're basically bringing them in and you have to hold them, or they're in your greenhouse for any length of time during the period of November through February in the Northern Hemisphere, you really want them under long days. And the reason for that is that will help initiate the flowers, so that you don't end up with the delayed flowers or uneven flowering of that crop. So in that early season, if you're bringing them in, which is what a lot of growers will do because it is a cool crop, you want to make sure that you get them under long days. As always, don't hold them a long time, because this one will root bound very rapidly. And when you get that root bound, they basically just don't root out, and so that you don't end up with the performance both for yourself and for the consumer. Also, make sure that when you're holding them, that you avoid any root wrapping up, especially at the top of the soil ball, due to improper watering. Remember, dry down to a level 2, lift those trays up, check the bottoms of the trays, and to make sure that they're drying down, and then water them up to a level 4, so that you basically always end up with wet dry from top to bottom. If you're holding them, this is a cool crop, as we mentioned. So basically hold them cold. 40 to 50 degree night temperatures, days less than 70 to prevent stretch is really important. Now, a couple of things about best management practices is we really want to make sure that we water in this plant before you plant them, and use some 20-10-20 to get them to branch and to get them to basically take off and grow rapidly. One of the problems that we see is that growers basically aren't feeding them before planting, and they kind of stall out, especially because it's normally grown under cool temperatures. And under those cool temperatures, if they don't have a nice feed in that plug itself, they're just not rooting out into the root ball where the nutrition is to get the plants growing. So we like to, at planting, before you plant them, put on about 200 parts per million for 20-10-20. If you're going to have to hold them for a number of days without any fertilizer, just operationally, then make sure that before you plant them, you put on more, like 300 parts per million. And if you're holding them for more than 7 to 10 days, make sure that you're putting some low-level feed on them continuously to prevent any fertilizer stress, and make sure that you're feeding them, again, with that 200 parts per million before you plant them. One of the issues with Dianthus is because a lot of these are interspecific, meaning that they take two different species and cross them together. And what that results in is you do end up with some off types, and the off type in Dianthus is it rapidly initiates flowers. If you're a plug producer, or if you're producing them yourself, are growing them under long days, a lot of times those seedlings will initiate very rapidly, and you'll end up with this problem as we see in this picture, especially on the early plantings where they've been grown under long days, where you have some plants that just basically flower rapidly and they're just like a runt in a pot, whereas the plant right next to it, you end up with a nice growth. So make sure that if you remove the plants, and what you're looking for is you want the plants with nice wide leaves. You obviously want to discard anything that's got a flower bud like the picture on the right. Or you also want to get anything that is spiking, that is basically, it's popped up and it's got these narrow, thin leaves that aren't very wide. So if the width of the leaf has gone down, those probably are initiated, because that's one of the tricks on figuring out, have my Dianthus initiated flowers or not. Dianthus can be used in an enormous number of different containers, everything from packs to pots to very large containers. So really it's a matter of looking to see what you want to use. So we look at a number of different crop times. It's a little bit longer crop time. That's why growers will plant them earlier in the season, especially during December, January, so that they can get the crop time in before they're ready to start selling them, around Mother's Day and beyond. So you really want to get them planted early, and basically you got to watch that photo period issue. Otherwise, they just will not initiate, and you're basically trying to sell them in June. Looking at different crop times, and one of the things to really be aware of is this an interspecific variety? If it's an interspecific variety, it really has a much longer crop time than things like floral lace or some of the more traditional older varieties. So you really want to go and look at your breeder recommendations, check their catalogs, and see what is the crop time that they're recommending, especially if you're starting to use some of these newer genetics that have entered the marketplace. This is a crop that is very sensitive to nutritional issues and also wet and dry cycles. And so really you want to make sure you look at the media that you're using, and you want to make sure that you're using 70% peat so that you can hold that nutrition, and that the bulking material or filler, things like hydrofiber or any other materials, don't start getting above 30%. So you got 70% peat and then the bulking agent. Always test before you plant. You want to get that starting pH about 5 to 6. It is tolerates a lower pH, and that the EC is about 1 to 1.5 using a 1 to 2 test method. So there's a lot of different soils, whether it's some wood fiber or it's coconut fiber or it's rice hulls or whatever, but make sure that you get that mixed correctly and that you've got it tested. One of the problems that we see every year, especially with Dianthus, is old soil. This picture basically is showing an example where the soil that was used for this group of plants was from last year. Because, of course, Dianthus being planted very early tends to end up with a lot of old soil, or soil that's been around for a while. And what happens is the wetting agent and the starter charge are depleted, and they're just not there. So when you take the same plugs and plant them in old soil versus new soil, you end up with plants that take off and grow and other plants that don't. If you feed before you transplant, it's less of a problem, but once you've got this problem, trays planted up like we see in this picture, you're just not going to be able to get them to take off ground. They're going to be anywhere between 2 weeks or longer delayed in performance, and they're just never going to be the same quality. So use fresh media, especially on Dianthus. When we start thinking about what we're selling as growers, we basically have to look at the moisture and fertilizer program, because that makes the crop. Basically, remember, the customers are buying what they see, which is the top of the plant. The growers, to achieve that, are producing root systems which will take up the nutrition, will take up the water, and produce that plant that the customers want. And how you get the tops is through the fertilizer that you're using. And of course, how do you get the roots is through the moisture. So this is why we really focus on fertilizer and moisture regime to optimize the plant performance. First thing about moisture is we have to remember that fish grow in water and roots grow in air. And of course, Dianthus will tolerate drier soil than most other crops. And in fact, if you keep Dianthus too wet, you're going to end up with more disease issues. Some people say, well, I don't like growing Dianthus because I ended up with a lot of Pythium problems. And then I've got, whether it's fusarium or any other of the diseases, those are all related to being too wet, not getting it dried down to that level 2, level 3 before you water them back up. So it's really important to get that nice fluffy white roots. That's how you can tell whether you're watering them correctly. When you pull that plant out and you got that fluffy white root, that will really scream, I've been watered correctly. If you see that root system that doesn't have that nice white fluff on it, that furry look, then you basically know that you're keeping them way too wet. So really, I can't stress this enough with Dianthus, it's about water management. So make sure that when you water them up, that you water them to level 4. Don't get to a level 5 because that just saturates the soil and creates an environment. If they keep it too wet consistently, so you end up with those roots that aren't nice and furry, the plants will be stretched. They're going to be very soft, and you're going to have a lot of Pythium problems, which opens up the plants to a whole nother group of diseases. Make sure that you don't go down to a level 1 where they wilt, because of course that damages the root system and it causes additional problems. So you basically want to make sure that you dry them down to 2 and take them back up to a 4. So you rotate up and down, kind of like a roller coaster of watering. When we water them in, because Dianthus tend to, when you receive them, have a very strong root ball, you want to make sure that you firm the soil up against that root ball. And to achieve that, when you're running it through the water tunnel, bend those nozzles so that basically as it's passing below the water, it's pushing the soil because of the angle that your water bars are using. So this is a real good tool to basically get you that soil firmed up against the soil ball. Now that we've got the plants planted, now we have to look at how are we watering them? What is our moisture management? You basically want to go and water in so that you're putting on enough water so it's just below the plug, so that when you do the initial watering, you may not get water all the way to the bottom, but you're getting water, 2/3 of the way down or just below where the plugs are in that first watering in. If you put on too much water, basically you end up with a perched water table, which is the water on the bottom of the cell, which is where you can end up with some Pythium problems, which will then prevent good rooting. So make sure that you water them appropriately. And how do we water them in? Is with that first irrigation is we want to basically take it to a level 3 to 4 at the bottom of the container. Water them so that they're basically, what is a level 4, Bill? It's just a single drip in some of the cells. If you've got water running out of the bottom of that container, that is a level 5. No question. So you really don't want to do it. So if you take a look at what happens when we have these different levels of moisture, as you can see at level 5, we're not getting a nice branch root system established right away after transplant. It's not until you make sure that you basically have that level 3, level 2, that you start getting a really strong root growth. Now you get good root growth at level 1, but unfortunately you don't get the top growth. So it's really in that 2, 3 where we want to be to have optimized root systems. Now let's talk about fertilization. Fertilizing early is more critical than fertilizing late. When you fertilize late, you're just blowing the plant up, making it soft. Getting that feed on early, especially as a pre-plant, is really important. Research that Bill Argo did a number of years ago looked at this as do we fertilize no feed at the time of planting or any time thereon? Do we do just one plant feed at the time of pre-plant? Do we do a pre-plant plus at day 14, a pre-plant at day 7 and 14, and do we do a pre-plant and then water them in with feed, and then 7 and 14 again? This is an example with begonias, but we've done this with a number of other crops, and it holds true across the board. Getting that pre-plant on can give you just as good a performance as using subsequent fertilization. So if you're basically concerned about working too hard and thinking too hard, think about getting that pre-plant, that early pre-plant on, and then if needed, put additional feed. One of the problems we do see with Dianthus is they are very sensitive to phosphorus deficiency. And why is that? Is because we're growing them very cool, which of course limits phosphorus uptake. But also a lot of growers are using phosphorus, low phosphorus fertilization. And so how we know we've got phosphorus issue is that we get this purpling, the reddening of the lower leaves. Because phosphorus is translocated from old foliage to young foliage, is basically as phosphorus deficiency always appears in those old foliage first. So if you see a lot of purpling in your crop, that basically should be the bell that says, I have a phosphorus deficiency. And to correct that is using a low level of 20-10-20 or 17-5-17. Basically, it promotes leaf expansion and will correct that problem. If you see that you've got a lot of foliage, but you're not getting the flower performance and you're getting a lot of stretch, basically really back off on that feed that you're putting on after you're doing the planting. If you see that the plants are just not sizing up, you're seeing a lot of dirt and you're not getting the plant to cover the soil, basically look at 75 to 100 parts per million plus a micronutrients on a regular basis. Excess feed only gives you growth regulator issues, meaning that you're going to have to apply more growth regulators. So you're going to have to work too hard. So don't overfeed, then you don't have to work as hard. One of the things that is really important, I think, and a lot of growers aren't doing, is make sure that you're putting some feed on that crop before you ship it out to the final retail and the consumer. That does two things. One, Dianthus has a good retailability holding at the retail, and will continue to flower and continue to look good if it has some feed in the soil. And that's why we want to make sure that when you put those Dianthus in, especially early in the season, because it is a crop that is suitable for early ship dates, make sure that you put some feed on it so when they're just being watered at retail, that you're basically going to keep the plant's nutrition up. It also helps improve consumer success. Let's just talk a little bit about fertilizer and the growth response. Remember, growth is a function of your water, the nutrients that are in your water, plus the fertilizer that you add, and the soil pH, which makes fertilizer available or not, different nutrients. So when we start out, let's make sure we've got a water test. Let's make sure we've got our water alkalinity at 100 to 200 parts per million alkalinity. That's kind of the sweet spot in the nutrition world. If you have higher, then you need to start looking at acid injection to get the alkalinity down. If it's less than 100 parts per million, you need to kind of watch that, because that can start to suppress the pH of the soil, which causes additional problems. So if you're at 100 to 200 parts per million, you're in a good sweet spot. Make sure that your water nutrients are within the normal range, along with the pH and the EC. And then, of course, we've always talked about make sure that you check your soil pH to make sure that it's in that 5.8 to 6.2. So when it comes to actually feeding, let's look at our early feed is using a constant less than 150 parts per million, because you can always add more feed, but trying to get rid of that feed that's promoting excess growth that then it requires you to put more growth regulator on is really hard to fix. One of the things that you really have to ask yourself is, am I putting on too much ammonia? Ammonia gives you very soft growth, gives you big foliage, makes your plants green. This could be good or it could be bad. If you start adding ammonia and high phosphorus, that's going to give you stretch. So 20-10-20 versus 17-5-17. So let's take a look at that range of fertilizers where you have high ammonia and high phosphorus to very low, no ammonia or high nitrate and low phosphorus. And remember that as you have more ammonia, that tends to give you an acidic response in the soil over time. Whereas if you have more nitrate, that gives you a higher pH. So the fertilizer can change the pH. What I've given you in this table is a collection of different fertilizers at 150 parts per million, and what percent ammonia is in that, and the nitrogen is in that fertilizer, and then how many parts per million are there of some of the other critical nutrients for good quality plant growth, which include phosphorus, iron, manganese, and boron. Just a word of caution about Dianthus. Dianthus is very sensitive to boron deficiency. So basically make sure that you've got some, if not a fair chunk of boron in there. I've given you some target ranges that you should be looking at. Now, if we look at these various fertilizers, 20-20-20, 20-10-20, 17-5-17, 15-5-15, 13-2, 13, 15-0-15, and we look at what percentage of the nitrogen is in the ammonical form. And as you can see, as we change from 20-20-20 to 15-0-15, the percent of ammonia, which is the stretching and soft growth, decreases as we go to these other fertilizers. Notice also as we reduce the amount of phosphorus, which is the middle number, you also reduce the amount of phosphorus. So as you start going down to 15-5-15, 17-5-15, notice that you start getting into the target range of that 10 to 15, less than 20% part per million at 150 parts per million nitrogen. And so that's why when we look at what is an ideal fertilizer, if you're just looking for a fertilizer that's going to give you nice, even growth, 17-5, 17, 15-5, 15, 13-2, 13 are nice fertilizers to look at. As you want to get more stretch, some more push on it, then you want to be looking more at 20-10-20 and also 20-20-20. So really that fertilizer can make a big difference. Notice that the boron, by and large, is just not present in a lot of these fertilizers. So really look at your fertilizer source to see, do I have boron? Check your water. Some people have very high boron in their water. Some people have no boron in their water. Because if you start seeing boron deficiency, that could be easily corrected. Let's talk about light, photoperiod, and temperature, because this is all about getting the plants to bloom. Dianthus is a high light requiring crop, so the more light you give it, the better off you, the better the performance. Under low light conditions, you get a lot of internodal stretch, especially if you've got a high diff or you are running them at high temperature. High temperatures or high light conditions will increase flowering. Remember that Dianthus is a facultative long day plant, which means that it will eventually, that's facultative, will flower under short days, but it really flowers faster under long days. The flowers, as we know, are terminal, meaning that they're at the top of the plant. So it's a factor of unfolding leaves, which we're going to talk about when we talk about temperature, because the faster you unfold leaves, the faster you express the terminal flower. Now, Dianthus, as far as initiation, it does have this juvenile stage, as we saw in that earlier picture where we had a plant that was still vegetative versus one that had a lot of flowers. That is a good example of a plant that had a very short juvenility, because it was induced rapidly, whereas the other plant basically was basically bulked up, even though because it was grown under natural or shorter photoperiods. So you can use the photoperiod to give you big bulky plants, delaying flowering, or you can use long days to promote rapid flowering. That's why we talk about if you're holding plugs, you basically should hold them under long days to basically make sure that they're induced at the time planting. Flower initiation occurs anytime the day length is greater than 13 hours. And you can use any source of light, whether it's incandescent, fluorescent, high pressure sodium, or even LEDs to induce them as long as the day length is greater than 13 hours. Once they're initiated, you're good to go, so photoperiod no longer matters. So when we start looking at when do we need to really be worried about photoperiod, is remember that we have naturally long days from September, about the middle of September, till sometime in April. So, sometime in that window, by the 1st of April, we're good to go. We have natural days, which are shorting from April to August. And there's a lot of publications available that give you the photoperiod. When do you have a greater than 13-hour day? You can basically, any of the weather apps will quickly tell you that. So if you're less than 13 hours, basically you want to be out there and get some long day treatment on them. Now, let's talk about temperature. These are responsive to temperature. It is considered a cold-blooded crop. There's not a lot of those. Pansies, violas, dianthus are all cold-blooded, meaning that their base temperature, which is at the temperature at which they don't grow. Nothing happens at 38-degree base temperature. But as you raise the temperature, the plants respond faster. Notice that some work that was done at Michigan State by Eric Runkel and Matt Blanchard very nicely showed that even at a lower 10 DLI, that they will flower if you raise the temperature. So once you've got your plants bulked up a little bit so that you really want to go and get them under longer days and warmer temperatures to get them to flower faster. Because notice they almost flower twice as fast at 73 degrees average daily temperature compared to growing them at 58 degrees. So if you need them faster, warm them up and they will take off and grow. So they really are very responsive. Soil temperature is a critical factor. So make sure that if you can keep the soils warm, that's really a good idea. And with Dianthus, remember, cold water suppresses the soil temperature. So you may, if you've got early in the season, if you have tempered water, that will go a long ways to warming that soil up. Avoid very high temperatures because you can start getting stretch. You can see these plants are starting to stretch a little bit. But if you're going to run them at high temperatures, make sure you get your growth regulator on them. If you're really trying to do this the simple way without a lot of photoperiod control or temperature, planting them about mid-season for your spring season is to give you the best results. So let's talk about a controlling stretch of these plants. Remember, excess fertilizer, it gives you a lot of leaf expansion. High ammonia and phosphorus will give you leaf and stem stretch. And so you really want to watch the fertilizer selection as far as controlling the overall growth. Remember, diff is your first line of control. Now, remember that what is diff? It's the day minus the night temperature. And when you start getting the day minus the night to be, 15 degrees, plus 15 degrees, so 75 days, 60 degree nights, the plants are going to stretch. Conversely, if you start running very cool day and night temperatures, the plants will be more compact. So if you want compact early flowering, running a warm night and keeping the days cool will keep you stretch, early flowering, and compact grow. You don't have to have a complicated computer system to do this and monitor it. Even if you just use a simple high-low thermometer, min-max thermometer, and you basically record the minimum of that day and the maximum, and then subtract the day the max from the min, or the min from the max, that will quickly tell you what is your diff for that day. And so if you know that your diff is increasing over time, then of course your growth regulator also has to increase in time to keep the plants compact. Now, let's just talk a little bit about something that is it's kind of unique, is that Dianthus has what is called an intercalary meristem. Now, what does that mean? Well, these plants stretch differently than any other plant we have. Most every plant that we grow basically stretches from the top, and the top, the upper node continues to elongate, and so you stretch from the top. Now, and so in the case of Dianthus, with this intercalary meristem, the active meristem, where the cell division is actually in the inner node, so it's actually pushing that stem up. Now, you say, well, so what? Well, why are we worrying about this? Well, the growth regulator that you apply is going to be critical, and your method of application is important because you want to get the growth regulator on the tissue that is causing the stretch. So, in the case of, say, a chrysanthemum or a petunia, which stretches from the top down, you basically get the growing points. You just kind of spray it across the top, and that basically controls the growth. Whereas with Dianthus, it's really important to get the growth regulator to go down the stem so that it gets caught into the axils of the leaves, so that you get your control down there at that base of that stem, right there in the axil, so that you can get the growth. So if you can see the picture, you'll see with the circle where the growth regulator needs to get. So a little more volume to get that down. Now, what growth regulators? You can use for toning purposes, dimenazine, chloromacot are okay, and Simidol is much better, but really, if you're going to use paclobutazol or uniconazole, they give you a much better control. As Nick Flax talks about in his weekly notes, he basically talks about the more aggressive growth regulators, and so your paclobutazol, uniconazole are more aggressive, and they basically will help control that much better. Now, making sure that you get the stem application so that it runs down that stem and gets that stem under control. The early control, you can use some sprays, but eventually you will have to look at some drenches. So that's kind of the controlling. So it's a little different than any other crop that we grow, especially some of the newer varieties that are more cut flower types. That if you're using those larger cut flower types and you're trying to keep them under control, take a look at that. If you're using the traditional Sweet Williams, the Dianthus barbatus types, these are really, really sensitive to that intercalary stretch. So really be aware of that so you can get that growth. When we look at insect control, Dianthus can be either ridden with a lot of problems or not much at all. And a lot of it has to do with checking the plants and checking for diseases and insects under your benches, because that's where a lot of these diseases come from, and over the benches. So just don't monitor above, also look underneath. Thrips are probably one of your big control concerns, because they will basically disfigure the flower quite extensively, and they burrow down into the calyx where the of the flower, and it's really hard to get rid of them. Mites can be a problem, especially in the last couple of years. We've seen more mites, and of course aphids basically dropping in. The disease risk, alternating leaf spots are kind of probably one of the more common one, and that's a fertilizer problem. You're basically running them cold, hungry, wet, and mainly hungry, and then you're going to end up with alternaria. There are a number of rusts that you can have, and again, that's a cold, wet conditions. Botrytis later in the season in the flowers, just make sure that you're running dehumidification, and then also, as I mentioned earlier, watch out for Pythium fusarium, and that's wet soils. So, Bill, are there any other places that you can get more additional information?
Definitely there are, and I also want to thank you for this rundown. There are a lot of nuances, it seems, to this crop, specifically because it is a cool season crop. You're starting it at a different time of year than you might be used to, but there are plenty of tweaks, like you explained, to lighting, to temperature, and then keeping an eye on that stretch. So thank you so much for that deep dive into Dianthus. And like you said, there are many, many resources. There's the Grower Talks grower guides for insecticides, miticides, and fungicides, biosolutions, anything you want to control with biocontrols. We do have charts and tables for what's most effective, and then the PGR guides for annuals and perennials. In addition to that, you can find hundreds of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week I send a newsletter, which you referenced with one of Nick Flax's tech tips. He writes every week, provides great grower information, and I send it out every Friday. We've created hundreds of videos on technical topics, tons and tons of podcasts, more than 150 in the archive. I suggest you go jump onto your favorite podcast app and listen to those. It's Tech on Demand Podcast. And if you want to connect with more than 6,000 of your peers in a closed Facebook group, just search Greenhouse Tech Team in Facebook. You got to answer a couple simple questions to prove that you're a professional grower. But once you do that, I'll let you right in. Like I said, Will, thank you so much for your time. We still have some more crops on our to-do list, so you're going to be back with me, right?
Absolutely. There's a lot of fun crops that we can grow, and we just sometimes just need a couple of interesting new tips and tricks to make them even better.
I love it. I love it. I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Take care out there.